Hey everybody, Rob Maurer here, and today we're talking about some of the newer details coming out on Model Y, as well as, of course, the ongoing situation in the macro environment. But we'll start off first with Model Y. As more owners are working through the delivery process, some more details are emerging, and one of those details comes from the motor vehicle purchase agreement. I haven't really seen this covered anywhere, but I thought it was pretty interesting because in that purchase agreement, it actually breaks down the Model Y by each of its options. And that means it breaks it down all the way to the base price for a Model Y, which actually is not listed on Tesla's website right now because they're not yet selling the standard range vehicle until early 2021. So TMC member RoboRat shared their purchase agreement for their Model Y, and it breaks it down with the base price starting at $41,000 and then layers in $19,990 for the long range all-wheel drive performance option, and then on this specific one, another $1,000 for the metallic paint. Knowing that base price is $41,000 is pretty interesting in and of itself, but I think it gets more interesting when you actually compare this to the Model 3 purchase agreement and the pricing across the lineup. For example, the Model Y Performance begins at $61,000 versus the Model 3 Performance at $57,000, and then the long-range dual-motor all-wheel drive Model Y starts at $53,000 versus $49,000 for the Model 3. So in both cases there, a $4,000 price difference. But then when we think about this $41,000 base price for the Model Y, that doesn't compare as easily. When we look at the motor vehicle purchase agreements for Model 3, and this is a recent one from just a couple of months ago, we find that same structure, but on the Model 3, they list the base price as the $35,000 standard range Model 3, which of course is not actually available online. You have to custom order those over the phone from Tesla. Obviously, the standard range plus Model 3 is what is slotted in as that entry-level option that Tesla's actually trying to sell. And that $35,000 base Model 3 seems to only really be sticking around for Tesla to say that they hit that milestone. And that's where I think this comparison gets more interesting because with the Model Y, they never gave a targeted base price like that. They talked about the spread being $4,000 to $5,000, and that's what we're seeing so far on the options that are actually available right now. But that $41,000 price would actually be a $6,000 spread from the $35,000 Model 3. And if we compare that $41,000 price instead to the standard range plus Model 3, which starts at right under $40,000, then we're only looking at a $1,000 spread. I think that gives us a couple ways to look at this. If Tesla decides to structure the Model Y similarly to how the Model 3 is structured and offer a standard range non-plus version of the Model Y, and they're using that as this base price, then that's a pretty bad spread, that $6,000 spread, and the base price Model Y doesn't look as enticing. But on the other hand, if Tesla actually never ends up offering a standard range non-plus version, and the standard range plus actually becomes the base Model Y, then we may be instead looking at a very favorable value here for the base Model Y, which would comp or compare to the standard range plus Model 3 rather than the standard range Model 3. Between those two options, I definitely feel as though the latter is more likely, that this base Model Y will actually compare to the SR Plus, and I feel that way for a couple of reasons. Number one, there's no reason for Tesla to introduce a standard range Model Y and then also have a standard range plus Model Y. I think Tesla just kind of stumbled into that situation for the Model 3, but there's no need to repeat that with Model Y and add complexity for minimal value. And then the other factor here is that we have heard Tesla say on previous earnings calls that because of some of the advancements they've made with Model Y, the cost to produce a Model Y should be almost exactly the same as Model 3. So having that $6,000 spread in pricing doesn't make a ton of sense. Yes, Tesla could do that and capture higher margins on Model Y, but it would make very little sense to have a $6,000 price variance between your base models, Model 3 and Model Y, and only have a $4,000 variance at the top of the line. Even if that $4,000 variance held steady across the entire line, when we're looking at the base models, that $4,000 is a much bigger percent variance than it is at the top of the line for performance, for example. So a couple things here. I think when we end up seeing this base Model Y for $41,000, I think it compares pretty identically to the standard range plus Model 3, meaning the range is probably going to be maybe 240 miles or so, and that it will include the things that the standard range plus has over the standard range, like autopilot included standard. So if that is the case, I think that is pretty exciting. And then I would also expect Tesla to maintain a larger spread in pricing than the $1,000 that this would currently indicate, meaning that over time, I would expect Tesla is planning to reduce the price of the Model 3 SR Plus from the current roughly $40,000 to maybe, I don't know, $38,000 or $37,000. and I would think the timing of that would align with the base Model Y, which again, the website says should begin early 2021. Of course, everything is fluid at Tesla. What's going on right now could change some of their timelines or some of their plans. But as of right now, that is my take on the situation, but I would love to hear what your thoughts are if you're on YouTube in the comments below. Next on Model Y are some details around a couple of things that I believe have talked about in the past, but some of the unique features to the Model Y versus the Model 3 that we're starting to hear a little bit more about and should be hearing even more about in the coming days as more of these teardown type things start to commence. These two things are the heating system for the Model Y and the amount of casting that is being used in the manufacturing for the Model Y. On the heating side, we know that Tesla has shifted from the resistive heating system that they've used in their other vehicles to a heat pump system in the Model Y. Teslarati had an article on this today, and Elon on Twitter responded to that article saying, quote, "Model Y heat pump is some of the best engineering I've seen in a while. Team did next level work," end quote. Somebody responded to that saying Sandy Munro will be blown away by the Model Y, which we'll come back to in a second. And Elon responded to that again saying, quote, "The heat pump and rear body castings are a step beyond," end quote. So if you're unfamiliar with a heat pump, basically, as simply as I can describe it, a heat pump uses the thermal energy outside of the vehicle and a combination of electrical energy and refrigerants that have extremely low boiling points, like -50 degrees Fahrenheit, which is pretty close to -50 degrees Celsius. So even with really cold outside temperatures, some of that thermal energy can still be harnessed and used to actually provide heat to the inside of the vehicle. So basically using your electrical energy to transfer heat rather than to convert electrical energy to heat. While the latter is very efficient, in many and most cases it's likely not as effective use of energy as the heat pump would allow for. Anyway, I'm not an engineer, but that is my best understanding of it. Somebody asked if this engineering was better than the super bottle, which you may remember was a highly praised piece of engineering from the Model 3's heating and cooling system, essentially integrating thermal management for the combination of the battery pack, the cabin, and the electronics, rather than parsing those out into individual subsystems. And Elon said in response to that question on the super bottle, quote, "Yes, PCB, which is printed circuit board, design techniques applied to create a heat exchanger that is physically impossible by normal means. Heat pump also has a local heating loop to spool up fast and extend usable temperature range. Octavalve is pretty special too. Team did great work. No credit to me," end quote. So obviously the concept of a heat pump is not new, but it does sound like Tesla has their own innovations here that have allowed for some pretty special technology for the heat pump in the Model Y. Moving on to the casting piece of it, if you're not familiar with casting versus stamping, basically the two ways to form metal. Stamping is pretty intuitive. It's where you have a sheet of metal and then you use a hydraulic press to stamp that metal into the form that you want, versus casting is where you're actually taking molten metal, which is metal liquefied by heat, putting that molten metal into a die cast, and then allowing that to cool in the shape that you want it to be. So we've heard a lot of speculation about the Model Y using more casting rather than stamping, and specifically using casting for really large pieces, reducing the amount of actual stamping that needs to happen in the manufacturing process, theoretically saving time and money. So this is where we get excited for the teardowns, specifically the teardown level that Sandy Munro does, because they tear the whole vehicle down, not just taking pieces off and putting them back on. And they also have a robust understanding of automotive manufacturing. So they tweeted today that, quote, "Munro and Associates is working on creating streaming material that you can all watch. We know some of you are very anxious to have updates on the Model Y, and we want you all to know updates are coming. Stay tuned," end quote. So I think we're all super excited to hear what Munro's thoughts are. They had some critical feedback on the Model 3 that Tesla has apparently implemented here for the Model Y. The last quick thing I wanted to talk about on Model Y is VIN count, since we haven't checked in on that for a few days. So the highest VIN that I've seen reported on the forums right now has been in the 3,000 range, but only one report at that level, a handful of others in the 2,000s range. So I think at this point, with just over a week left in the quarter, that gives us a pretty clear ceiling on what Model Y deliveries could potentially be. Obviously, we're not going to have more than 3,000 deliveries if we don't see a report of a VIN above 3,000. And remember, these VINs are not necessarily assigned linearly, so we're likely to see a delivery number much lower than the highest VIN that is reported. So that ceiling, I think it's the most important takeaway from the VINs, but based on this, I would probably guess that right now we're looking at maybe around 1,000 Model Y deliveries this quarter, but we'll keep a close eye on those VINs here and any other information that we get over the next few days it does sound like Tesla may be having some delivery issues with a lot of these shelter-in-place orders that are going out in different states right now. So that leads us, I think, nicely into the macro environment. Obviously, a lot of pressure right now. I think the perspectives are really mixed. Eyes this week, I think, are really focused on the stimulus package that is sitting in Congress right now. The market seems to be anticipating that will be passing in some way, shape, or form here in the next couple of days and providing some relief. But at this point, that may actually already be priced into the macro environment and might not actually provide much of a boost, but really tough to say. I know there's a lot of back and forth between the Democrats and the Republicans right now to try to get something that they both agree on. So how that ends up shaking out will probably determine the direction the market takes, at least in the super short term. In the US, we continue to see more states locked down. We have, shelter in place or stay at home orders now in New Mexico, West Virginia, Oregon, Connecticut, Ohio, New Jersey, Michigan, Massachusetts, Maryland, Louisiana, Indiana, Delaware, in addition to all the other states we have previously discussed. So almost easier to list states that are not sheltering in place right now. And then we also have today the UK announcing that they'll be going into lockdown. Canada not officially heading there yet, but making comments of moving in that direction. And of course, those lockdowns impact the economy. The market did respond somewhat positively to some Trump comments today, seemed to boost the after-hours trading when he said, quote, "I'm not looking at months, I'll tell you right now, we're going to open up our country," end quote, essentially saying that they would be reevaluating what the lockdown and restrictions look like after about a 15-day period. As we discussed, though, last week, over that 15-day period, we're probably still in pretty dire situation here in the US. And I think until that starts to level out, we're going to find it really difficult to ease any of these restrictions. So I think we're just going to have to wait and see on that. In terms of positive news, other countries definitely have made progress here. So China, I think for the 5th day in a row, has reported no new domestic cases. All their new cases have been from people returning to the country. So at least for now, they seem to have gotten a pretty good handle on it. In Europe, we're starting to see percent increases diminish. So while new cases are still growing, the percent rate at which those new cases are increasing by is becoming smaller. And while that doesn't necessarily mean that you're out of the woods yet, it is a sign of progress. And I should clarify, I don't mean total Europe, I just mean some countries are starting to report this. Like Italy, for example, those growth rates are declining. So those represent positives and can increase the positivity in terms of the outlook for the United States. But on the other hand, we continue to be very early in this in the US, and the numbers are about to get a whole lot worse. We're actually seeing case and death growth rates increase here. So even with higher bases of case counts and deaths, they're growing faster over time. So where you might have seen a 30% growth rate yesterday, you're now seeing a 40% growth rate, even though that base is increased. And that's really not what you want to see. And I know people are going to make the argument that those case increases are just because we're doing more testing now. Yes, that is true. But that has nothing to do with the growth rate of deaths, which we're actually seeing some concerning data in New York on. The Financial Times put together a table here looking at the growth in deaths since the 10th death was reported in different localities. So they compare New York with Washington, with California, to places like Wuhan in China or Lombardia in Italy. And while we're pretty early in the curve, and while California and Washington are actually pretty low in comparison to some of these other regions, New York is actually, at this point in time, this many days past the 10th death, which in New York we're about 4 days from right now. And up until that point in time, out of all these localities, New York has been the fastest growing. So a really bad sign there for New York. But again, California and Washington are actually among the 2 lowest on this list. So there's a lot of data out there. A lot of it is going to be conflicting at this point in time. That's why I started off this by saying there's mixed reactions, I think, from a macro environment perspective. But as we continue to move in time, we collect more and more data, we'll get more and more certainty, and the market likes certainty. The other things to keep an eye on as we move through this week, the Purchase Managers Index reports for services and manufacturing industries both happen tomorrow. So those are a couple of flash indicators of economic activity that people are going to have their eyes on. And then on Thursday, we will be getting a highly anticipated jobs report. So in that report, we get the continuing jobless claims, the 4-week average of jobless claims, and then probably most importantly with this report is the initial jobless claims. So that is how many new people are claiming joblessness. Bloomberg has the consensus for that initial jobless claim number at 1 million people, up from 281,000 in the last report. So if you are watching the macro environment, those are a couple things to keep your eyes on this week. There is also a GDP report on Thursday, but it is for Q4 GDP, which is obviously much less interesting than Q1 or Q2 GDP. Last quick thing here is on ventilators. So we know that SpaceX and Tesla are looking to assist with the production and distribution of ventilators. Tesla has secured about 1,200 of these so far. Elon did clarify on Twitter today that they didn't actually manufacture those. They simply purchased them from China, brought them over here in an expedited fashion, and are working to get them to where they need to be. But as of yet, they didn't actually manufacture ventilators, though Trump did tweet that they now have approval to do so. So that is it for today. As always, thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Tesla Podcast. And if you want to support the podcast, you can find those details at patreon.com/Tesla Daily Podcast. That is it, and I'll see you tomorrow for the Tuesday, March 24th episode of Tesla Daily. Thank you.